Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Humans of Wharton. The child of Elena, who is regretfully not with us today, but today Miguel and I have the distinct pleasure and honor to welcome another of our classmates, Sam Sidiqi, who is on the line with us today. So Sam is a globe-trotting executive. He is a philanthropist mountaineer. He is a husband, a father, a brother. I'm sure his son is so as well, and a fellow Wharton and also Lauder grad. So Sam, welcome to this episode of How.
Thanks so much for hosting me. Great to see both of you.
Maybe just to start with, a quick background on you, and we'd love to hear from you. Where you're from, where you grew up, kind of what and what led you maybe to join Wharton at the same time as we did. So why don't we kickstart with that?
Yeah. So my background is I was born in Afghanistan, but my mom's American, so we moved to the U.S. when I was really young. I grew up just outside of Philadelphia. I went to public high school there. I grew up in a little town called Swarthmore. Later on, went and did my undergrad at MIT. And after that, I spent a year abroad. I'd studied Arabic in college, and so I did a year with the Fulbright program studying Arabic in Egypt. And that was pretty formative and will kind of contribute a lot to what we talk about today. I then went to work for Bain & Company, where Miguel works now. So I did a couple of years with Bain in Boston. And that's what led me to Wharton, was thinking about what's my next step. So I enjoyed consulting, but I just didn't see that I was having maybe the direct impact I wanted to on companies. And I thought, hey, why don't I go out to the Middle East based on that experience I had in Egypt? And what's the best way to transition to going out there? I thought, well, Wharton and specifically Lauder with the Arabic track would be a great way to kind of reposition myself to start a career out in the Middle East. So that's kind of what led me to Wharton and the Lauder track. That's, I guess, the key parts of the background.
That's great. And obviously, go ahead. I'm sorry. Keep going.
No, I think that was kind of the pre-Wharton stuff. We could also go into Post-Wharton. Is where I started to look was,
why don't you?
I could have gone towards consulting because that was where my experience was, but I had this idea of getting into industry. And so what Wharton and Lauder kind of led me to was there was a Wharton alumnus named Tariq Sultan who had a company in Kuwait that he was building up. And so I said, all right, let's try this opportunity in industry and jump right in. So I joined this company. It was called Public Warehousing Company back in the day, PwC Logistics. And I joined them out of business school. My wife and I moved to Kuwait. And that company, PwC Logistics, which is today Agility, ended up being kind of a bit of a roller coaster for me. So because they were so thin on the ground, and part of the reason I went to the Middle East was I said, look, there's so many MBAs out in the US, very well qualified people. In the Middle East, there just aren't as many. So I figured that would be a way to maybe accelerate my career and get additional opportunities early. And certainly that worked out within this company in Kuwait because they had a lot of cash, they were growing, but they didn't necessarily have all the management expertise. So within the first 4 months, I was working on building a warehouse in Turkey. We were looking at some stuff in Iran, and then they asked me to work on a very large acquisition. So it was their largest acquisition at the time. It ended up being a $420 million acquisition of a global company, and I was the lead on doing all the diligence, the negotiations, managing the bankers, managing the lawyers. And so that was my first year kind of post-MBA. And that led me to, after the acquisition, I moved to LA. So it was a year in LA. And then we moved to Switzerland, where I became the head of strategy and execution for the European operations. So 3 years in Switzerland, but kind of running all around Europe. And then they asked me to go to Afghanistan, which was kind of a very interesting opportunity for me at the time. Tough on the family, but an interesting move. So that was in 2009. I moved to Afghanistan. Spent a couple of years in Afghanistan. A lot of strange things happened to the company, so I had to kind of reshape the Afghan operations. Then I moved to India. I continued to look after Afghanistan as well as Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and some aspects of the Indian business. And then I was kind of tired and done traveling and had issues in India. So I shifted to, I was about to come back to the US actually. So the only thing that was kind of available to me was consulting. So I've taken 3 or 4 steps back down the ladder in my career in terms of seniority. I would have had kind of a post-MBA role was available to me in consulting, or do something else. So the chairman of the group asked me to stay there in the region. And in exchange, he said, "Oh, I'll back you on this mine that you want to do." Because I started seeing these opportunities to get into mining in Afghanistan. So that was a provision. I moved to Kuwait, and I took over the parent company of the logistics company as kind of a turnaround situation. And that was a real estate company called National Real Estate Company. So we did national real estate in Kuwait for some years while kind of starting up the mining company, which was just in a bidding stage. So that was my main career thing, you could say, was the turnaround of national real estate in Kuwait. And once my wife and I were kind of done with Kuwait, we left that opportunity and moved to the UAE. And I took on a job there without doing a ton of diligence. So I did that job for about a year before the board and I couldn't really agree anymore. So I spent about a year as CEO of RAC Properties. But the timing worked out well because as the things ended with RAC Properties, the mine in Afghanistan really started getting going. So what we decided at that point was that my wife was done with the Middle East, 100%. And my daughter was getting to the age, she was about 4. And we said, look, let's have her be from a place, not just be transient. So we decided to move back to the US in the middle of COVID. So in June of 2020, we moved back to the States. And now I'm set up here and working on the mine in Afghanistan as well as the foundation. So that's, let's say, the high level of where I've been these last few years.
Wow. That's quite a whirlwind. I mean, I must say, I've heard names of more countries and maybe more roles than I would say I could fill in too many lifetimes. But that's clearly, I mean, a pretty amazing trajectory that you followed. Obviously, one country that you've mentioned several times, and which is the one where you're born, is one that today is going through a lot of turmoil, I would say. Clearly worthy of probably a much longer conversation and over many drinks and with a lot to discuss. But would maybe just love to hear you share, and for the audience benefit, maybe some thoughts on really what's happening there. Obviously, there's a very long history of the country itself, then of what many powers, or call them maybe leading countries in the world, have done to that country over time, from the Brits to Russia to then the US, and obviously most recently with the withdrawal and a bit of the, I don't know if we should call it a debacle or not. Before we just got on with everybody here, Miguel was actually highlighting the fact that the information that is coming out of that area of the world is certainly incomplete, doesn't provide a complete picture, and so I think it would be great to hear your views, your thoughts, probably as a much better informed person than any of us. So maybe what and from your family's perspective also, hope everybody's okay. I understand your brother evacuated recently, so anyway, a lot maybe to talk about, but just a few minutes on that might be
sure. So I think the most immediate thing that I was concerned with was that my brother is working on the mine with me, and his daughter, who's 18 months old, was with him. He and his daughter both have the U.S. passports, but his wife is Afghan. They weren't planning to leave Afghanistan, so she just has her Afghan passport, and she didn't have any visas. So they couldn't get out in July just because the U.S. embassy's been closed. There was no way to get visas. And we didn't think it was going to happen as fast as it did. So when things really went bad, and then he was trying to get to the airport, it was quite intense for a little while. So, I was calling congressmen and senators and contacting different people and doing what we could to make sure that the family could travel together. Because we were sure Amir could always get out, and certainly with his baby, but he didn't want to leave without his wife. He didn't want to take his baby and leave the wife behind. That wasn't an option. But then they were stuck kind of with those masses of people. So, the Taliban had an interview in India recently, and the Indians were pushing them, saying, if your government's so great, why does everybody want to get out? And the Taliban guy here responded, he said, look, if the Americans showed up with a bunch of planes and said anybody can fly to the US, Delhi airport would also get pretty crowded. So he kind of turned the question around on the Indian guys. So there were a mass of people trying to get into that airport, and nobody could control the situation. So my brother had to deal with kind of carrying his 18-month-old daughter, walking by dead bodies, just in a really risky position, probably for a few different nights. But finally, they got into the airport, and there were some trials and tribulations in Qatar and then Germany. But they got here, and they're doing well, and it's great that we've had that family reunion. But if we look at what's going on in Afghanistan, kind of what happened to an extent, a lot of it comes down to being really clear about what your objectives are in a place, and then what can sometimes be mission creep, and changing the mission but not the resources or the approach sometimes. So if we go back to 2001, 2002, when the U.S. government toppled the Taliban and came in and decided to do something new, a new government was created, right? So that new government that was created was incredibly centralized. So the president of Afghanistan actually chooses the local governments. So if you can imagine, the governor of Pennsylvania is nominated by the president. There's no local election for the governor. And you also have to imagine a system where, in the U.S. we have this key phrase, no taxation without representation. So the Afghan system was a war economy where the money came from the U.S. So you have a very centralized system where all the localities are officially being governed by the center. And that center doesn't need any resources from those places either. So it was a very broken system from the get-go. And if you have that broken system where you have no mechanisms for responsiveness and no need to make it work, you can see that government as basically being a parasite on the system. And that parasite doesn't even have any responsibility to keep the cow alive. This is a parasite on the cow, assuming the Afghan people are the cow. The parasite doesn't even have to feed the cow because the U.S. is feeding the cow. So it's almost a purely parasitic organization. And not that there weren't good people. There were some good people in there trying to do good things, but there were a lot of bad people who were just stealing. And a lot of people of Afghanistan recognized that. And there were people stealing huge amounts. And then if lower levels observe their seniors stealing huge amounts, then they'll start trying to steal small amounts by just making problems for people. So it was a fully corrupt system. We have to understand it wasn't a great system. And, as much as the Taliban were bad and certainly killed people, and I haven't been a fan of them, let's say, how they ruled in the 90s, when the U.S. government and the Afghan government pursue drone strikes and night raids, and you wipe out villages and you wipe out villagers, that is also going to create blowback, right? So there are a lot of people who, if their parents were killed by a drone, that's also a form of terror, right? And people saw that terror and wouldn't support it. So all of those things were going on. I think that Obama recognized the hopelessness of the situation during his term, and there was a push at that time basically saying, listen, why are we here if our objectives accomplished? We shouldn't be here. Who's best set to manage it? And so the plan at that time was basically to hand over the country to Pakistan, right? So the ISI had Taliban they've developed, so let them manage it. But you have to understand that there's a big military-industrial complex, right? I was there working for a contracting company. Agility had large contracts to feed U.S. forces. So there's a system that happens in the U.S., that happens in Pakistan, where when you retire as a general, you go and you work in private industry. So you have to understand that a lot of these Pakistani generals were making a lot of money off of the logistics costs. So the U.S. was spending, I think when I was there in 2010, 11, it was about $120 billion a year in contracts. And a good chunk of those were available for contractors. So I don't think that Pakistan was super excited for that to stop either. So there was a lot of Afghan government, Pakistani contractors who said, why would we stop this gravy train? So Obama wasn't able to fully get out at that time. But I'm sure that Obama and Biden had a similar point of view on this. And Trump had his own point of view. Hey, why are we there? And I'm not necessarily a big Trump fan, but I think he had some clarity about getting out. So once you're going to get out and a system is going to fall apart, if you've ever built a house of cards, there's no way to take it apart card by card. If you're going to take apart a house of cards, the cards are all going to fall down. So I don't think it was that big a fiasco. I think it was reasonably well managed. The thing is, once everybody knows it's gonna change, then it just runs faster. So I don't think there was no intent for the Taliban to go into Kabul. What happened is that there was supposed to be some kind of a stalemate and then a negotiation. Somebody played a little bit of a game and the stalemate didn't occur, right? So somebody got the Afghan forces to switch sides along the way. Some payments were made. Usually people buy their way into these wars. And so the fighting didn't happen. And then it became so inevitable that the police force disappeared in Kabul. And so the Taliban weren't going to enter. They were on the outskirts. But then criminals came into the city claiming to be Taliban. And they were stealing from people. And so at that point, there's no law and order, and the Taliban were starting to look bad, so they had to enter. But now this puts the Taliban in a horrible position because the sanctions are in place. So the U.S. government took $9 billion of Afghan money due to sanctions and blocked it. So I used to be on the board. I was a chairman of AIB, the largest bank in Afghanistan, until March. And when you're on a bank, when a country runs, it's the salaries, it's the imports, it's everything. So the banks have been closed since then, and there's no cash in the economy because there was a process for flying in the cash from the U.S. to give to the banks to go out. And so as a business owner in Afghanistan today, I can't give salaries to my staff because there's no cash. So people can't buy food. So we're focused on, these mostly elites, let's be clear, who are trying to fly out of an airport of a country that's suddenly much more peaceful. But at the same time, we're kind of putting our hands around the necks of these Afghans who are suddenly facing higher food costs. Food could run out at some point because we have these sanctions in place. So it's a complex situation. We'll see. We'll have to see where it goes.
Yeah, Sam, this is super interesting. Now everyone is blaming on bad process management, the U.S. wrong decision, Joe Biden on the line, he will regret this for the rest of his career, UK as well. In hindsight, it's interesting that you mentioned, well, it was not that bad a plan. It's just the house of cards, that's how it falls. But in hindsight, what would you have done differently now that you know how things evolved?
That's a tough one. I think, from the get-go, if you look at the elections, there were elections where there was this guy Karzai versus Abdullah, and then it was Abdullah versus Ghani. In each case, Abdullah actually won all 4 elections because there was an election and a runoff. Abdullah actually always won those, and the U.S. would come in and decide that, no, we like either Ghani or Karzai, and then pay Abdullah off. And Abdullah's always been very kind and he would accept the funds and not have war. But there were some decisions made along the way about who is the leader of the country, and once you've made that decision, you're stuck with it. In terms of this drawdown, it's very hard to do it in a different way, right? You hand over the country to its government, and if that government fails, it's going to fail, right? Maybe, I guess you could have started pulling out people earlier, but the U.S. was pulling out people and telling contractors to leave quite aggressively through May and June, right? So people were telling my brother to go, and he said, look, I'm here with my family, I can't go. But they were telling all the contractors to get out. They knew it was time to get out. Again, it moved faster. there may have been a lack of coordination. Once it was clear to the world community the Taliban were going to be in charge, it may be that some governments wanted to get a little bit closer to the Taliban and the ISI, so they may have helped that acceleration. It's unclear. So maybe there could have been more coordination in terms of being clear the acceleration was going to happen. And I think the other really important thing is they should have accelerated the negotiations of the banking side of things, right? You need to have a plan for this interim government so that you don't get dislocations, right? Because we saw during Corona, if somebody loses their job, the problem is that it's sticky to find a new job. So once somebody's out of work, once processes stop working, let's say I'm a food importer. Today I might have some credit, I might have some arrangements. If those arrangements fall apart, how does it start up again? My supply lines with the distribution within Afghanistan, if those shops get closed, then how do you restart that? So the whole economy could really get messed up right now. And, maybe the international community is like, okay, it's Pakistan, Afghanistan's problem. So there might be a little bit of sticking our finger in the eye of the people who are now in there. But, it's part of the negotiation, right? The U.S. is going to want the Afghans to do some things. And so they're going to hold it until they do these things. But hopefully they can get to it.
Sam, we could go on this topic forever, and maybe as a last question, maybe with let's say a hint of hope as to what's going to happen over there. How do you see things evolving in the next, say, I assume the next 6 months to a year is probably up in the air. Nobody really knows, but what's your maybe view and maybe hope and aspiration for what could or should happen with Afghanistan over the next 5-10 years? And obviously you have economic interest there, you have a personal attachment to the country, you also have a charity there, Afghan Peaks, so you have I'm sure you have a lot of I would say vested interest, not just economic but personal. So what's your view as to what will happen and what would you like to see happen?
So what we're seeing announced is that the Taliban are supposed to announce their government. And what Rand and all these people have been talking about over the last year and a half, is to kind of look at the Iranian model so that you can have some kind of a government which is elected, quasi-elected at some point. But then over that, you have some kind of supreme religious leader who kind of keeps things on track. So that's been a relatively stable thing that's been going on in Iran. It's a way of giving Taliban ultimate power while maybe seeding and creating space for different people to manage different parts of the government. And then that government could maybe meet international requirements and needs. So I think that was the goal of a lot of the think tanks and people that have been talking about it over the past year. So now we have to see, is that what is actually produced? Because that's what you would negotiate in a stalemate. But now if you're the Taliban and you've won the whole country, do you feel you need to do that? And the only reason they would need to do that is to get these funds released. So that's where kind of the relative negotiating power of the trade-offs is gonna be seen. The Taliban are acting quite nicely. So if the Taliban go through and do what they say they're going to do, then hopefully there's reconciliation with the international community. They get recognized, and there's law and order, and Afghanistan can start to grow again. So that's the ideal scenario. But these negotiations don't necessarily go the way they want. We would like them to. If the Taliban don't share power enough, then maybe you have a lot of people unhappy and you have some fighting against the Taliban regime. And there's a risk that they never reconcile with the international community, and there's just this interest to kind of keep it a failed narco state so we have a place to test weapons, right? So that would be the horrible case, which I hope doesn't come to place. But we'll have to see. We'll have to see how that plays out.
Sam, going more on a personal note, we could spend hours on this, as you said, Pierre, but I'd love to see it a little bit from your eyes, because you probably, since how you were raised and you explained it before, you probably feel part Afghan, part American, right? And that's where you grew up, and that's where you live now. And you learn Arabic, you live in an Arabic country, so you have these two models with different principles and different lenses on how they see life. How are you feeling right now? Are you feeling frustration? Are you feeling like, well, at least they're going to let this country run its own path? Or what is going through your head?
Yeah, I think it's inevitable, right? That something had to happen. So again, one of the perspectives I have was sitting on the board of a bank, and one of the main lines of business of a bank is to lend money. And you do your diligence process and you lend money to good businessmen. And what we found over the last 2 years was that no businessman wanted to take a loan. No good businessman who would want to lend to would want to take a loan, because nobody would want to invest in this kind of uncertainty. So if you know a house is going to fall over, let's be done with it and start the new house. So I think I'm more hopeful than disappointed, right? I think this change had to happen. It's been, let's say, clear from the last 5 years that something had to give, and so better that it's done, and hopefully a new government is created on maybe more representative foundations, that's more focused on governing and rule of law, as opposed to just kind of petty thievery.
Maybe to talk about the business aspect of it, and I'm sure that might interest some of the viewers. But so you still have a mine, if I understand correctly, business over there. Is it operational today? How is it affected by the situation? How do you and your brother, I guess it's like the ultimate remote management experience, I guess, maybe these days. So how does that work out? How do you manage that and that uncertainty?
So just to be clear, so if we talk about mining in Afghanistan, to step back, it's interesting partly because it's been untouched. So when a lot of the modern mining exploration techniques were created in the 60s and 70s to find some of these very large deposits, Afghanistan has been at war since then. So Afghanistan is kind of one of the last untouched countries where you can find really massive deposits close to surface, hopefully somewhat easily. And so that's why it's so exciting. But what that means is we're not talking about an operating mine, we're talking about an exploration project. So in 2012, when I created the company, it was to create a company to bid for an exploration project. And although there was a tender process, whatever things were happening, the government just put everything on hold. So no contracts were awarded until 2018, when the World Bank and the US government, who'd been spending hundreds of millions of dollars on these processes, said, listen, we've got to do something. So they finally made a decision to sign our contract and a couple of others. And then from there, the other contractor didn't even get a license. So our license only came in 2019, and we're the first large-scale exploration license in Afghanistan's history. The Chinese have one large mine, INAC, which is their contract that they're maybe going to develop. But we're the first, let's say, tendered large-scale exploration license. And so when we say exploring, we have an area that's very prospective for being a mine. But what we've done is we did satellite analysis and then soil sampling. We do an inversion model of the soil. We then did rock sampling. And now we've started drilling. So our operations are actually a very light footprint. So we just have an Afghan subcontractor who knows how to drill and who knows how to organize people, and hire a geologist who's just out doing very simple things. So that part of it is still continuing. But the challenges are, for example, cash, right? So who is going to send money for fuel and food if the banks are closed? How do you pay your staff? Right now we cannot pay our staff because the banks are closed. So those fundamental problems are there. One of the steps that we would have typically done in year one, but we wanted to do drilling first and then moved it to year two, is magnetic analysis. And so we bought this machine for $15,000, $20,000. That's about the size of a suitcase. It's not very big. But now I have to ship it in the country, and there's no way to ship it into the country. So it's tough right now. But the key thing is, the sanctity of the contract. And the Taliban told the U.S. government, because the U.S. government was negotiating with the Taliban last year, said, no, we're going to respect all the contracts. So I believe that the new government will, support us and want us to be successful. But again, we're going to have to deal with the sanctions issue. So if the sanctions issues don't get cleared, then as an American citizen, I will be unable to work with this new government unless the U.S. government gives me an exception or unless those sanctions rules are changed.
When I hear you talk now, I feel like, I don't know anybody else who could be doing what you're doing. And I think that because of your background, because of all that you've done, and etc., it sounds like, listen, you can handle something like this, when to me, I would be shaking my head and throwing my arms up and be like, let me run away from you. I have no idea what's going on. I don't know how to do this. How would you say that Wharton and your MBA experience and Lauder and all have hopefully contributed to help you do what you do today?
Yeah, I think...
and maybe have not.
Yeah, I mean, some aspects of it are, you gain confidence when you go through the roller coaster of life. But, Wharton was part of that roller coaster. And, reading the case studies are really useful to say, hey, what actually happened in history and what can I take from that? So we had a professor who I think he taught Lauderites later, but I had him just at Wharton, named Witold Heines. And, it was, I don't know if it was political economy or political risk, but he had these great examples of just realpolitik and how you work through it. So one example he gave was in Indonesia, where I guess there was a president, I forget if it was Sukarno or Suharto, who ruled with an iron fist, and he was quite bad in terms of being having a regime full of bribery. But the interesting study from an academic perspective is he had not one heart attack, but multiple heart attacks that he survived from. And so what you could do is you could look at the stock market and see what is the economic impact of your relations with this president. So you could look at all of the companies that were associated with his daughter. And when he had a heart attack, you could see what was the effect on their stock price. And when he recovered, you could see the effect in the other direction. And one of the takeaways from that class that I've always kept with me is that sometimes it seems like the obvious answer when you go into a difficult country is to be close to the person in power, because those people in power will give you a benefit. But one of the key lessons is that it's a double-edged sword. So if you go too close to that power, when that power goes away, it can also take you down with it. And so that lesson that he gave to me, when I was in Kuwait, we had a very large investment project in Libya. And I was talking with our Maltese partners who had managed this real estate development there. And I was like, well, obviously you were close to Gaddafi. And he said, no, we were never close to Gaddafi. We always worked very well with the Libyan government as an institution, but we did not get close to Gaddafi. And that saved them when Gaddafi came down later. So that's kind of one of the case study lessons that was then reinforced in my career, is always about when and how do you engage in a country with its institutions versus with certain people. And then the lessons also, how do you then avoid bribery, right? Because if you want to work with those people, that would lead more towards bribery, whereas if you can engage with the institutions in a different way, you can avoid it. And so that's... There was definitely some stuff in Wharton that I got from some of those classes that helped prepare me and helped me see some of what was going on.
That's quite fascinating.
What are you looking forward to these days, Sam? Be back in the US with your family. With this.
So my biggest thing is I want to find mineralization. I'm looking forward to finding mineralization in my mind. So, when you're digging a mine, you have a place that's prospective, so you think there could be something there. And then you do the next thing, you do the satellite, which is second order data, and it says, okay, you're seeing alteration that indicates you could have it. And you do the soil samples, which is still secondary, you're not touching the rocks. And then you get the rock data, so you're closer to it, so you say, we know we're in a system. But you still need to strike the mother lode. So you don't really know what's below you, and you're poking into the ground, just hoping to hit something. And so I'm dealing with that risk while also just thinking about what's that?
Now, are you hoping to take it to development as well, or is more of a I just want to strike gold, and when the opportunity is there, sell it to the big Chinese company that will come and do it?
I think whatever works for the country. So I would enjoy developing it, and I think the value of me staying involved through development would be to make sure that it continues to be good for Afghanistan. Because there's a lot of history of mines which can go in, you see them in Africa, where they'll just kind of turtle up, take care of themselves, give the bare minimum to the government, not really do anything for the local communities and get out. And part of the reason I wanted to get into this was to make sure that I had a say, to make sure that the mining companies would benefit the local community. So my partner and I, my partner was my old boss from Agility. He and I agreed that 20% of our equity would go back into developing the mining cluster of Afghanistan, so that we'd be training employees and that Afghan citizens would become part of that value chain and not just observers of Westerners taking money in and out. So that's been important. And then I've also been donating more of my shares beyond that to my foundation. So if the mine goes well, then that will benefit the foundation. But if I can stay involved in that company, at some point I'll be diluted out, or I might have to sell out completely. But if I'm just diluted and kept as part of the process, I could see my role as being some kind of an ombudsman to make sure that the mine is actually doing good for the Afghan economy. And that will always be part of my negotiations. There's three exit paths you could think about to get the mine built. So one path. So once we prove that there's a resource, and there was a report from SIGAR, which is a Special Inspector General, to Congress that said that there's $18 billion of copper in this mine, which may or may not be true. Once we've done the exploration, we'll know that. I think they were ahead of the game, but it could be a big project like that. So to get a big project like that financed, if there's $18 billion of copper, then you're talking about a mine that would cost maybe $1 billion to build. So how do you finance that? The easiest way is you sell to a major. So if there's a major who's interested, you sell it to them, and they take that responsibility and risk. And maybe I would stay on board or not. That would be their call. Another way is to list in Canada or London. Canada is very well known for junior mining companies, and investors from all over go there, but just their listing regime and makes sense for that. So we could list it in Canada and then use those funds to build the mine. And then another third interesting way would be to do a pre-sale. So you could talk with the smelters in Central Asia, pre-sell your copper, and then use that pre-sale, pledge it to a mining construction company, and then let them construct it. And then you kind of keep all the equity and keep all the risk and manage a different house of cards. So that's probably the riskiest one. And I don't know that I have the skill set to do that, but it might be fun to hire up the people with that skill set and do that way. But it'll be driven by the geopolitics of what's possible at that time, and what's best for the country.
Sam, you mentioned on a couple of occasions the charity, right? I mean, the foundation, sorry, that you've created. Would you mind talking to us a little bit more about Afghan Peaks and what you're trying to do with it?
Yeah. So when I was growing up, I have an aunt who lives in Alaska, and she didn't have kids. So many summers, my sister and I would go up and stay with her. We even lived there. I went to school for half a year when I was in 6th grade. And so I've always been up there kind of and had exposure to the mountains. And, I got stuck in my career and just doing my career stuff, and I never really got back to that. But then I was in Afghanistan, and I came across these people who had done mountaineering, and I said, well, I guess I could do that too. And while living in Switzerland, I started to get back into skiing. I was thinking, well, aside from my career, what else matters to me? What's important to me? And I just started climbing. I climbed Mont Blanc and started getting into that. And then I came across these Swiss guys who had started a ski competition in Afghanistan called the Afghan Ski Challenge, and they had the Bamiyan Ski Club, and I thought that was just such a wonderful thing they were doing. And so the more I got into it, the more I said, hey, this is something I'd like to be a part of. So the first thing I did was they were trying to train a couple of Afghan skiers to go to the Olympics. And so they had their training session, but they needed more funds to compete in the European races. So I contributed to that, and I got to know them a bit. And then I got to know they had established a avalanche protection team within the Afghan Ministry of Public Works. So there were some people to go out and control the avalanches. There's a certain pass in Afghanistan that's up over 4,000 meters, and there would be years where 100 people would die in a single avalanche on this highway, and it just was uncontrolled. But this guy had been trained, and he learned to understand the weather, how to set off the avalanches before they were dangerous, all those things. So I did some contributions, did some training for his department. And then I said, well, let's formalize it. So a couple of years ago, I actually created the foundation. And the foundation is basically, so what Afghan Peaks will do is to focus on the development of the mountains. And it has 3 areas of focus. One is mountain safety, which is avalanches. One is mountain sport, which today is skiing and climbing. We could add mountain biking, some other things. We'll be open to that. And then the last is nature preservation. Because the other part is to think about what can Afghanistan be in the long term. So with 30, 40 million people landlocked, you're never going to be a powerhouse of production, right? You have 1 billion people in China, 1 billion people in India, even Pakistan at over 200 million is a much bigger place. So you're never really going to compete with those in terms of manufacturing. But Afghanistan does have these beautiful mountains, and it could become a tourist outlet. But you can only become that tourist outlet if you keep a beautiful, pristine nature. So the country will only benefit from that tourism if its own citizens are earning from it. So that's why we need Afghans to be trained to be ski guides, mountain guides. And then there's the innate pleasure in itself. When you go to this Afghan Ski Challenge, it's mostly Afghan skiing, and they're enjoying it. So I see some economic benefit. It's not going to be the biggest driver for Afghanistan. I'm not saying it's going to solve all Afghanistan's needs, but it is a benefit for Afghans that I'd like to support. And it's fun because I like to do it, right? I like to ski, I like to climb. And so I started to have that vision, and I've been pursuing that more and more in these last years.
That's great. So for all of you watching here and loving skiing and thinking about doing some, heli skiing in Canada or something, maybe watch the space and wait for a few years and see Sam, offering us opportunities to hit some never hit before slopes in Afghanistan. That would be amazing.
The skiing out there is really fun, so I'll be happy. I've only done it once, but I plan to do it more, and I'll be happy to take a group out there as soon as it's safe enough to do so.
Have you ever thought about getting into politics?
Yeah, I've thought about it here and there. So in Afghanistan, I'm kind of a unique enough resource that if I learned the language, I could maybe do like central bank or look at being a minister or something like that. So that's something that at some point could be a possibility if I wanted to do that. There's a lot of risks with that side. On the U.S. side, I don't know. It's something where maybe I'd like to contribute a little bit. But so much of it is just such a game that you have to decide, do you really want to spend time playing that game or not, right? So there's, the money you have to get elected and the network you have to make. You're doing that for the power. And then once you're in those networks, are you really in a position to do anything? Or do you really just have to do what the networks tell you to do? So I don't know that I would necessarily make as big a difference doing that as doing what I want to do and like to do.
Sam, what does Wharton, I would say, mean to you today? Is there, do you tap into the network for, reasons or personal ones or?
Yeah. So there were a few of us in the Lauder Arabic track, and I understand that the Arabic track might not exist anymore, but we were the first Arabic track. And actually, a few of us ended up in Dubai. So Karim Farah, although he didn't stay for the full years of Lauder, he did the summer immersion. And also Philippe Audi, were both there in the UAE, and it was nice to just have the chance to get together with them. And Walid ended up in London. He comes to Dubai now and again, so I saw him in London once. So I've kept that connection along the way. And there have been other Wharton groups that we get together in Kuwait a little bit, and then also in Dubai. So I've had the chance. One of my favorite and best employees was a Wharton grad, Raghav Gandhi, who came a couple years after us. So it was great to be able to find somebody, and he was introduced to me from somebody in my network. One of the board members for my mining company, the representative of Agility, he's a Wharton grad, Hassan Hori. So there's been a lot of Wharton in my network, and I continue to see it as an important part of the things I do. I am also working on I have a friend who has a startup called Cognitive Healthcare International. It does remote patient monitoring. He started this up in Dubai and has really great technology. So he's asked me to help him start that up here in the US. And I'm not in that healthcare space, right? I've been in logistics, real estate, and banking, but I haven't done healthcare or technology. So in order to help get that started, I reached into my Wharton network, and there were just some amazing people, Ethan Prater, Scott Matthews, Anita Promoda, who are just really well established in these fields, and you get just really accelerated in terms of the networking and thoughts that people can share with you. So Wharton's been great from that perspective as well.
If you were asked to fill in the blank of this sentence, what would you say? So Wharton is a place where blank. What would you say?
Wharton is a place where you can reinvent yourself. I think, because if you look back at kind of where I was as a consultant versus having that chance to relaunch my career in a very different way, and I think if you also look at your experiences where I believe you were a lawyer and then you shifted into business, I think it's a great place to reposition yourself, and it gives you a lot of credibility as you do it.
I'd concur with that. I would completely agree. I don't know if you're like me, but I think it could be interesting if there was another MBA-like experience that you could have kind of a little bit later in your life. I don't know. I'm not that I don't know about you, but we've I think everybody and hopefully most people are happy with their path through life. But it's true. I think that our 2 years over there were incredibly. I don't know. To me, I consider it's kind of it helps you kind of accelerate your life. But you were probably right. Reinvent yourself a little bit. And I don't know if if you had that chance to do it again. I don't know. It'd be tempting.
No, it was a pleasure. I had the chance when I was in undergrad. I was really focused on a lot of sports and activities. I was in my fraternity and I was doing dance troupe and track and just really loving life, and it was great. But I wasn't quite as focused on the learning for learning's sake. I was still kind of had that high school viewpoint of, take the classes and pass the test. And at Wharton, I kind of enjoyed just reading the stuff and learning. And that was just a pleasure to just, be able to learn stuff. It was fun. And I do appreciate that aspect of it.
This is good, and I think this has been a good chat. Sam, thank you very much for your time. It was great to reconnect, to see you again after so many years, and hear where you're up to. And thank you. And you're doing fantastic stuff. Definitely, you are the type of guys that when I read about and I listen to you, I feel proud about Wharton, about what you're doing. So great connecting again.
Really nice to connect. I really appreciate it, guys. Thanks so much.
Yeah. It's been super nice hearing from you, hearing how you're doing, what all that you've been through. To me, I mean, I'm just blown away. I sometimes feel like, I have a pretty exotic life, and then Sam Sidiqi comes on the line, and then I feel.
Come on, Pierre-Alain. You live in the suburbs of New York. You haven't moved from the suburbs of New York for the last 15 years. That's not exotic.
When I say exotic, listen, from a little guy coming from Belgium, I mean, it's like, ooh. I live in America, it's
exactly.
But no, I mean, listen, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you, hear from you, and as with Miguel, absolutely amazed by all you've already accomplished. And if you thought you were a little bit younger than maybe some of us, clearly me, because I was a little bit older when I went to B school, actually, it sounds to me like you've already accomplished so much. So, good on you, and Godspeed for the years to come. So it's been great talking to you.
Thanks.